Love our piano player. Hello, welcome. How's everyone doing today?
Hooray!
It's good to see all of you. My name is Daniel Cobb, and I would just like to say that, for everybody who's ever looked up at the stars and really wondered what was out there, looked at a flower and just had a moment of profound introspection, welcome home. This is your home. And thank you all for coming here. As a matter of fact, if you would, turn to your neighbors and tell them, welcome home. Because everyone belongs here, everyone is welcome, and we are so glad to have all of you today. We have a wonderful presentation for you today. I am very excited to finally hear Reverend Harold, is it Bew or Bo? Boy. I wasn't sure. It's a German name?
Yeah, EU in German is Oi.
Okay,
Like
so
Deutsch or Freude.
that is probably the last way I would have pronounced his last name, so I'm glad I asked just now. I'd like to go ahead and start us with the Unitarian Universal Principles, so if you would, please look up to the video slide and we'll begin that. Thank you very much. If you would, please go ahead and take this time to go ahead and silence your cell phones and other electronic devices, and we thank you for that. We don't have much in the way of announcements up here, but we do have one, and that is for the next Sunday service on February 26th. We have the privilege of Mrs. Georgia Blackman to be our speaker this Sunday. Mrs. Blackman is an icon in the Pensacola area, once providing a bookstore that became a haven for African American men and women to congregate and empower one another. We welcome Mrs. Blackman back to UUCP as our guest speaker for next week. She will talk about the newly reopened Ella L. Jordan African American History Museum, as well as the African American history in Pensacola. Mrs. Blackman led the efforts to restore the museum after the devastation of Hurricane Ivan in 2004. The museum will serve as an educational beacon and museum for our community and for our roots. Next, we will have our opening hymn. It is number 113, Where is Our Holy Church? Reverend Harold Boy is going to lead a call and response, and I will let him go ahead and describe how this is going to go.
Thank you, Daniel. I was talking to Daniel about doing this hymn, and I like in black churches, they have this call and response. I mean, the audience is in communication with the minister all the time, which really is energetic and community building and all that kind of stuff. So this hymn is actually a question and answer. Did you notice that on 113? Right? You're looking at me. So what I thought I'd do, this is an experiment. The word experiment means to try something, right? So what I'll do is I'll sing the question, and then everybody does the answer. Does that make sense? So if you're willing and able, please stand and join us. Where's our holy church? Want to give us the last bar or two? And where is our holy church? Where is our holy writ? Where is our Holy One? Where is our Holy Land? Where is our paradise?
We will now go ahead and continue with just a moment of centering here with some music provided by Bobby. We will now have our opening reading, which will be number 468 in your hymnal, and the chalice lighting. This is a call and response between me and the congregation, so where you see the italics, please respond if you are willing and able. We need one another when we mourn and would be comforted.
We need one another when we are troubled and afraid.
We need one another when we are in despair, in temptation, and need to be recalled to our best selves again.
We need one another when we would accomplish some great purpose and cannot do it alone.
We need one another in the hour of success, when we look for someone to share our triumphs.
We need one another in the hour of defeat, when we prefer our strength to fight and stand again.
We need one another when we come to die, and would have gentle hands prepare us for the journey.
All our lives we are in need, and others are in need of us.
And now we will have the recitation of the covenant. If you would join me standing, please. Thank you. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Thank you. You may be seated. And now we will go ahead and move into the Time for All Ages, which will be led by Bradley Vinson, and she's coming on up here. Thank you, Bradley.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Since we just celebrated Valentine's Day, I wanted to read a little story about love, but I'm just going to have the kids sit around me and have you guys listen in. This is called Worm Loves Worm. Worm loves worm. Let's be married, worm says to worm. Yes, answers worm. Let's be married. Wait, says cricket. You'll need someone to marry you. That's how it's always been done. I'll marry you. Now? Can we be married? Asks worm. Wait, says beetle. You've got to have a best beetle. Naturally, that would be me. Now, can we be married? Asks worm. Wait, say the bees. You need bride's bees. Can we be the bride's bees? Yes, says worm. Now, can we be married? You'll need to get rings to wear on your fingers, says cricket. That's how it's always been done. But we don't have fingers, says worm. We can wear them like belts, says worm. Wonderful, says worm. Now we can be married. Just make sure to have a band so we can dance, says beetle. But we don't have feet to dance with, says worm. We can just wiggle around, says worm, like this. Fun, says worm. Now we can be married. You guys have to wiggle my arms. But you still need a white dress, a tuxedo, a top hat, lots and lots of flowers, and a cake with frosting, say the bees. But we don't have heads for hats, says worm, or hands to hold flowers. And we only eat dirt, says worm. Wait, says spider, I can attach the hat and flowers to you with my sticky web. Thank you, say worm and worm. But who will eat the cake? Ask the bees. I can eat the cake, along with cricket and beetle, says spider. What did you say? Asked cricket and beetle. Nothing, says Worm. We can be both. Amazing, says Spider. Really? Asked Beetle and the bees. Wait, says Cricket. That isn't how it's always been done. Then we'll just change how it's done, says Worm. Yes, says Worm. And so they were married, because Worm loves Worm. That's the most important part, right? All right, thank you. You all join me in singing the children out.
I love Worm too. It was a great little book. I wish I had read that right before I got married and said, you know what, let's just get away with all that stuff. Would have made life so much easier, right? Okay, so this is the point in the service where we do the offering. This is also your opportunity to place your joys and concerns into the basket, which we will then read and light a candle for after the offering is collected. And while that is being passed around, we'll have a little bit of music by Bobby on the piano. Next up, we will have our message. As previously stated, it will be presented by Reverend Harold Boy. He was a UU minister for 32 years in, I believe, Ohio. And during that time, he also served as a history and civics teacher in high school. He firmly believes that civics is by far the most important class that should be taught in school. And he has 3 grown and launched children. So congratulations on launching all 3 of them successfully. Please welcome up Reverend Harold Boy.
Thank you, Daniel. I should make a correction. I lived in Ohio and I went to The Ohio State University. Oh, God. You know that "the" thing that they use? You've heard it, right? The Ohio State. That started when I entered Ohio State, and it's such an affectation. I just, you could say the University of Florida, right? Anyway, so thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here, and unfortunately I can only be here for a short time because my wife and I will be heading back to Michigan. Oh, by the way, I need to make a correction. I was going to say I was never a minister in Ohio, but I went to Ohio State. I was a minister other places. But we're going to be heading back, and it makes me, there was an embarrassing moment for me with my wife. We originally were in Perdido Key, but the hurricane came in and destroyed much of Perdido Key, so we moved a little bit west and we're in Alabama on the Gulf. And what we like there is that we're right across from the Gulf Shore Park. How many of you been there? Yeah, right. Just an amazing place. They got all these critters, like armadillos and alligators and river otters. I didn't know there was a river otter. I mean, I lived in California for many years, and there were sea otters, but my wife walks every day, about 6-7 miles a day, and she walks through the park. I walk maybe once a week, so she's seen a lot more than I have. I mean, she saw the eagle. There's an eagle nest, and she actually saw the eagle. And she saw a bobcat one time. And so I'm looking at the map that they have for the park, and they talk about going to this place, and there are RVs there, and they say you can see the exotic snowbird. And I said to my wife, "Did you see the snowbird?" She said, "Honey, that's a joke." And I go, "Oh my God." I originally thought there was a snow, but that's who we are. We're snowbirds. So unfortunately, we'll be gone at the end of this month and come back January. I wish I could stay more, be with you more, be involved more with your congregation, but such is life. On December 5th last year, I turned 77. I guess that sounds old to many people, maybe not to many of you, but as long as I'm healthy enough, 77 doesn't seem any different than 67 or 57 or 47 and so on. As Popeye the Sailor Man said, "I am what I am." In whatever age we are, there we are. Of course, now I experience more aches and pains, and I have less energy than I once had. And I have a greater likelihood of some health crisis. But then a person can have health challenges at any age. It's just that it's more likely as one gets older. Truly, though, age really doesn't matter that much in terms of making a good life. I'm reminded of what the late Harry Emerson Fosdick, the famed preacher at Riverside Church in Manhattan, said, "Nothing else matters much, not wealth, nor learning, not even health. Without this gift, the spiritual capacity to keep zest in living." I want to share with you some reflections concerning my generation as I graduated in 1964 from high school in Chillicothe, Ohio, which, by the way, is a historic town. It was the capital of the Northwest Territory and the first and third capital of the state of Ohio. Actually, my class was at a precipice. It came at the end of what was called, excuse me. It came at the end of what was called the silent generation, and at the beginning of the baby boomers. Actually, my sister was in the baby boomers, and her class was a lot bigger than my class. She was just 13 months behind me, a year behind in school. Anyway, in other words, we came from that stated conventional 50s generation. as we moved into that turbulent 60s generation. At my 50th high school reunion in 2014, I had a number of conversations with my former classmates about the characteristics of our generation. We acknowledged that we were more hopeful then and less cynical than people are today. Our class actually bracketed the John F. Kennedy presidency from the time he gave his inaugural in January 1961 to his untimely death, the assassination on November 22nd, 1963. And I remember that day as if it were yesterday, and I imagine many of you can remember that too. It was so unbelievable. Excuse me. I, like so many other young people at that time, were inspired by his words in his inaugural address. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And I followed that. I want to do for my country. I consider myself a patriot to this day. I love my country. I love our freedoms and so on, with all its faults, My generation, well, we thought we could solve the problems of the day of war and poverty and that very touchy, sensitive issue of race. The civil rights movement seemed to be going in a good direction at that time. I think it's fair to say that we were naive. For our aspirations for a better world were dashed by certain events, including the assassination of John Kennedy, but later came the Vietnam War. But also the violence connected to protests about that war. There were not many people involved in the violence, but there were some. As well as assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy, plus scandals involving politicians and business tycoons. Because of all that, because young people's feelings were raw and they were impatient, wanting justice and peace, they sometimes grasped at what they consider to be their right to behave provocatively, practicing casual sex and using drugs. They did this in the name of freedom. And many of them argued that we shouldn't trust our government. In particular, we shouldn't trust the older generation. As the tagline went back then, don't trust anybody over the age of 30. How many of you remember that? Yeah. Amazing, huh? Ah, yes, youth. Distrust of our government, the threat of violence in order to get one's way, drug use, and provocative and irresponsible, even violent behavior, are the sad legacies of some of the people in my generation. And those legacies still live on to this day. There was an added personal grief for me to the turmoil of that time. In April of 1968, shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., my father took his life. He was 47, and I was 22. As you can imagine, I read many books about the subject of depression, anxiety, and suicide. I've been to a number of therapists and counselors in my life, and I talked about my father. But I also would use the time to talk about my relationships of today and other things. I use that time to get to know myself better. And I recommend it, actually, to all of you. Even if you're doing well in life, I think it's a prophylactic thing to do, to go and just talk to somebody who listens. That's the beauty of therapies. They listen to you. Some years later, I volunteered to work for suicide prevention, and that was a godsend. It helped me to handle my grief. I can say I never had the thought of ending it all, But I have known depression. I've had the dark night of the soul. But I always knew there would be a better day. I had that faith. And there always was a better day, always. My father did not have that faith. He just ran out of hope. I'll speak about him later. But in thinking of the 60s, people forget that many of us did try to make a difference. I know I worked as a VISTA volunteer, Volunteers in Service to America, working for welfare recipients in the Welfare Rights Organization in Pittsburgh. I had a chance to go to West Virginia, but actually Jay Rockefeller, do you remember him? Jay Rockefeller, any of you? He was a VISTA worker in West Virginia, and later he became, he became their U.S. Senator. I suppose if I went to West Virginia, I would become a senator. I know that my work at VISTA gave me a sense of purpose, making life gratifying, but I also don't know exactly how much good I did. I do know that it was a way of intimately to know how poverty and racism works in our nation. Nevertheless, today many people are cynical, angry, having turned inward. Worst of all, some have given up hope. No wonder. Over the years, our nation has suffered from political and business scandals, from economic and environmental crises, unjust world wars, social unrest, and sadly, as we witness from recent events, a setback to the progress that we made in civil rights in the 1960s. Plus, we have lived through a pandemic, the worst that we have witnessed in more than 100 years, though we're not entirely out of the woods yet. And most disturbingly, a little more than 2 years ago, we had an unprecedented event of an insurrection of Americans against our national capital. To add to that crime, perhaps even more disturbingly, many who are political leaders and media pundits and so on do not want to treat that event as significant. People seem more willing now to believe the most outlandish lies about our government, about our leaders, about professionals such as our doctors, lawyers, scientists, teachers, and God forbid, even our clergy. That's supposed to be a joke. I have it as a laugh line here. Anyway, all in all, we have experienced a great blow to the body politic. We citizens of the United States have suffered, and we're confused, angry, and afraid. It is that fear that I will speak to today. Why are people afraid anyway? Especially those of us who are well-fed, well-clothed, well-housed, and well-educated, and have the freedoms to express our opinions about our government without fear of being put in prison. For example, when we look at the insurrectionists of January 6th, we see that most of those insurrectionists were in that category of being well-housed, well-clothed, well-educated, well-fed. This is from a report on the radio station WBUR in Boston. Robert Pape, who directs the Chicago Project on Security and Threats at the University of Chicago, has been analyzing the identities of more than 700 people arrested for breaking through the barricades that day. Pape says the picture remains the same. He said over and over again, people interviewed by officials said they went to the Capitol on January 6th to support former President Donald Trump and claim Trump as the legitimate president, not Biden. He said, this isn't just simply normal criminal behavior or escalations like street fighting. Right-wing extremist violence is usually strongly linked to skinhead gangs or militia groups. But as of December 2021, he said, 87% of the Capitol rioters he analyzed were not members of violent groups like the Oath Keepers or Proud Boys. 87% were not. Unexpectedly, more than half of the January 6th insurrectionists were white-collar workers, such as business owners, architects, doctors, and lawyers. More than half. He says only 7% of those arrested were unemployed at the time, nearly the national unemployment average. Unlike right-wing extremists who are young, normally under the age of 35, the January 6 rioters were mostly in their 40s and 50s. The key finding Pape made is that these rioters were not from deep red parts of the country. More than half of the more than 700 people arrested hailed from counties that Biden won. More than half. Rather, Pape found that the most notable attribute of the rioters is how many insurrectionists came from counties that lost white, non-Hispanic population. Think about that. Their neighborhoods were changing. And this makes sense to me because I have confronted a number of people who have decided to move from their neighborhood because, quote, the wrong kind of people, end of quote, have moved in. I've also heard that in the media, such as cable television, especially social media, of influencers who are promoting the idea of this notion, replacement of white people. Replacement of white people. Now, I think most of us here, if not all of us, can see that's an irrational fear. But it's a kind of fear that infects all of us in profound ways. We see here in the great state of Florida, people losing their freedoms, losing their access to good education and health care, freedom to control their own bodies. They're losing those freedoms because people here have those kinds of irrational fears. It should be noted that fear can be rational when we are confronted with real danger, where we could be hurt or destroyed. The human species could not survive without fear. What I'm talking about here is the irrational fear, the destructive fear that author Bernardo Overstreet wrote about in her insightful book, Understanding Fear in Ourselves and Others, published in 1951. She introduces the thesis of her book in her opening words. Of all the emotional forces that pattern our individual and interpersonal behaviors, fear has that most insidious power to make us do what we ought to do and leave undone what we ought to do. Go back. The most insidious power to make us do what we ought not to do and leave undone what we ought to do. Under its influence and trying to escape its influence, we seem fated to give it a stronger hold upon us. If today we live in time of crisis, it is in large measure because the fear-born follies of individuals and groups that have piled up into the present. Errors of omission and commission crowd us now, demanding of us a swift new wisdom about our destructive fears and the conditions that foster them. To call a halt to this compounding of folly, or even to slow its progress, we must become clear about some of the reasons why we have not yet made an adequate attack upon our human fear problem. It sounds so prescient, contemporary, I'm sorry. She could be talking about today. And she wrote this in 1951. It suggests a universal problem, a universal human problem, that we all need to be vigilant. As Tom Paine said, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And this suggests to me that if we're to lessen the problem of this destructive fear that has gripped the imaginations of so many people, such that their lives and the lives of those around them are made miserable and less democratic, then we need to lessen their fear. We need to lessen their fear. Also connected with this fear or anxiety is depression and anger. Anger is an emotion that people often use to cover their fear, their hurt. That's especially true of men. And I'll speak to anger later. How then can we help people to handle their fear? Our church, this church, can be a healing force in our nation to counteract the craziness that we're experiencing right now. We can be a holy church. The word holy derives from the word whole, as in wholeness, and it gives us the word health. Holy, wholeness, health. Thus, our church can be holy in all senses of the word, a place where people can come back who are fractured and put their lives together and be made whole. A place where health is not mere physical health, but the zest for living, as Reverend Fosdick talked about. One book I found interesting that I believe can help us move to a more holy, healthy, and wholesome place is Lost Connections. You're depressed, and how to find hope, by Johann Hari, Hari. Hari makes the case that the Western modality of treating depression and anxiety with antidepressant drugs is wrong-headed, mostly. He himself was terribly depressed, an anxious young man, for 13 years, and was treated with those antidepressant drugs. And it made him better for a while. But then he reverted back to his depression. As a journalist for the Guardian newspaper in London, he decided to study the issue and found that most people who used those drugs would in time revert back to their depressed selves. So he traveled hundreds of thousands of miles around the world to study how other people and cultures treat depression. And he also talked to many experts about the issue. And what he found is that depression is better treated with social methods. For example, he tells a story about going to Cambodia right at the time that antidepressants were entering that country. And there was a rice farmer who had a tragic accident of stepping on a landmine and losing part of his leg. He was fitted with a metal prosthetic leg, but found it was too painful to work in the rice paddies with all that water. He became quite depressed, staying at home all the time, crying himself to sleep. Doctors suggested an antidepressant, but the town folk said, well, we already have an antidepressant. And the doctors thought, well, maybe they're talking about some herb like St. John's wort. But no, what they were talking about is something else. The town folk went to be with this farmer, to be there with him. And they listened to him. And they tried to find out what he wanted. And they discovered that he liked cows. He liked cows. I wonder if you can imagine what they did. They bought him a milk cow. And then he milked that cow every day. And his depression left him. The cow was the antidepressant. There's so much more to this book that I would like to share with you, but just don't have time. I invite you to read it. But what I'm trying to get across is Hari's idea that we can help people with their depression, anxieties, and their anger by creating a community based in loving kindness. Indeed, it's the Unitarian Universalist way, as expressed in our principles, primarily the first principle, that we affirm the worth and dignity of all people. I think about, for example, about my father, who was very much involved in our Unitarian Universalist Church in Columbus, Ohio. Indeed, he was the choir director for a time. I wonder if someone might have noticed my father, Carl, was not showing much joy in his life. He may even show irritation, had a flat affect. I can tell you that he displayed anger a lot. Men, as I said, tend to hide their vulnerable feelings, their hurt and their fear with anger. We can see that in the movie A Man Called Otto. Have any of you seen that movie? Yeah. Starring Tom Hanks in the eponymous role of Otto. Otto is one of those cranky, get off my lawn old man, only very much so. And he's also suicidal. He's helped by a neighbor, a delightful, intelligent, strong-willed mother and wife, Marisol, an immigrant from Colombia via Mexico. Marisol is beautifully played by Mariana Espinosa. Now, I know that anger can be a positive emotion. It can be energy, a response to injustice and to a threat and to people trying to dominate us. But it often portends danger, as I discovered working with gang members in the Los Angeles area. And a gang member can become angry just because someone from another gang looks at him in the wrong way. They call it mad dogging. And that can lead to an altercation, or even worse, sometimes violence, sometimes even death. And in my studies of political science and history, I also know how anger plays a role in creating major world conflicts. For example, our government's invasion of Iraq on March 19, 2003, which was immoral, illegal, and illogical, would not have happened without the anger of many Americans against Muslims, who remember the attack on the World Trade Center buildings and the Pentagon in September 11, 2001. Again, fear and anger can be seen as positive attributes, but they can also be destructive. And as we noted, anger and fear are combined with depression. They go together. Anxiety, anger, depression. So I wonder if a member of our church in Columbus might have noticed my dad showing irritation for no discernible reason, or showing some sadness, or just emptiness in his eyes. If a person could go on up to him and say, "Carl, are you okay?" Have a genuine concern for him. That might have put my father on a blessed cycle as opposed to a vicious cycle. Maybe not. Maybe it was impossible, but it would be more probable if people would respond to him with loving kindness. One more thing in closing. There was the rest of us, his family, the survivors. We were left with grief. We needed attending to as well. Grief is universal. We all experience some kind of loss in our lives. If not the loss of a loved one, perhaps a broken relationship, or we can have the added pain of rejection, or the loss of a project that failed, or even a pet, or perhaps your favorite candidate lost, or a sports team lost. When I was a student chaplain in seminary, my supervisor, Dick Flowers, who was a Southern Baptist minister, told me, "Harold, we all grieve all the time. In the beginning, when we lose a loved one, the grief is hard. It involves sadness and crying, even anger and fear. But over time, our grief changes and reminds us that we have loved. We have loved. And eventually, we even learn to laugh and enjoy life. But we always have that place in our heart, that longing, that nostalgia of missing our loved one. That can be a pleasant pain, actually. What helps us through is to know that there are others out there to give us comfort in the best way we know how, of being there. Often, what I learned working with very sick people as a chaplain is that is all we can do, is to be there. For we have no power to cure. We do not have the knowledge, the expertise to share knowledge, information about their disease. But often all the patient wants is for us to just be there, to listen. If need be, to hold their hand, to care. That is what we can do as members of the church. Simply be there for people. And I close with these beautiful words by Helen Keller, speaking of grief. We bereaved are not alone. We belong to the largest company in all the world, the company of those who have known suffering. When it seems that our sorrow is too great to be borne, let us think of the great family of the heavy-hearted, into which our grief has given us entrance. Inevitably, will feel about us their arms, their sympathy, their understanding. Believe when you are most unhappy, there's something for you to do in the world. So long as you can sweeten another's pain, life is not vain. Go in peace, friends.
If you would, please rise as you are willing and able, and we will be singing hymn number 170. We are a gentle, angry people. Hymn 170.
We
to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. Thank you. Go in peace.